Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. It's good to be with everyone tonight with our, shared struggle, but also as a joyful disruptor, the importance of radical self-care and joy, because we get burnt out when we're pushing uphill on these social justice issues. So I hope in the next 10 minutes to have a bit of a 10-minute change maker mobilization to unleash the joyful disruptor in all of us in these really tough times. Really pleased to speak on behalf of the Equality Trust tonight, which campaigns for a more equal society that works better for everyone and not just the richest few. I have been given 10 minutes to speak, and if you haven't already done the actions that Henry's kindly popped in the chat, there's a few petitions that you can add your name to and write to your MP to take those actions as I speak if you haven't already. And I did all the actions and they took me less than 5 minutes. So if you can also share them with all your memberships and community groups, the more of us who take those 5-minute actions, the better. So we'll start with just a bit of context. As we know, the UK is one of the most unequal countries in the world, and despite being one of the richest, our levels of inequality have actually got worse over time. We also know that inequality harms everyone, as other speakers have touched on, and not just those at the sharpest end. Everyone suffers in more unequal countries. And the Equality Trust has commissioned a report called The Spirit Level. It was done originally back in 2010, and it looked at all these statistical inequalities. There's been a 15-year update report, and it's on the Equality Trust website, and that might be useful for those of you who want to campaign and have facts and statistics to support some of the arguments and campaigns you're making. And research paper after research paper, like the Spirit Level, have shown that in countries and communities with higher levels of inequality, more people suffer from ill health, with more people dying younger and getting sicker earlier. The evidence also shows where inequalities are greater between rich and poor, that there are higher instances of mental health, including addiction struggles. Education attainment is overall lower. There's more distrust in democracy, and more people report that they are unhappy in their lives. By contrast, in countries around the world with greater levels of equality, people are healthier, live longer, and with better physical and mental health. Crime and rates of imprisonment are lower, and people feel safer and happier. In more equal countries, economies are stronger because, as I think Cindy was touching on there, if everyone has money in their pocket, the high street businesses and the art scene can all thrive instead of the decline we all see in our local areas. So the socioeconomic duty can help to make that shift. So what is the socioeconomic duty? Whilst I would never say that any law is a magic wand that's going to fix everything, we know that laws alone don't create change. It's grassroots movements like we have here that are an important part of it. But law can make change, as we've seen in other areas of equality in history. So the socioeconomic duty is Section 1 of the Equality Act 2010, but it hasn't yet been commenced in England. It just hasn't been given a start date. So it's been described as the clause that could have stopped austerity, or at least challenged or mitigated it. And it's made up of just 47 words, and I'm currently writing a research paper on it. So these 47 words of this duty, this small duty out of 200 provisions in the Equality Act of 2010, is very small, but has real potential power. So what the duty says is for public bodies must consider ways to reduce inequalities of outcome associated with socioeconomic disadvantage when they are deciding policies. And this spans from national government departments and cabinet ministers right down to local authority level. So your local council, police and crime commissioner, fire service and so on would be subject to this duty once it's activated. However, though it was brought in 2010, and it has since been activated by the governments in Scotland and Wales, in England it still remains uncommenced. The important thing about those 47 words that make the socioeconomic duty and can help us, I think, when we're engaging people in our campaigns, is it recognises two really important things. Firstly, that socioeconomic disadvantage in itself can result in inequality of outcomes. And secondly, that public bodies have a role to play in achieving equality of outcomes and not just equal opportunities as previous equality laws have focused on. So that's quite a powerful shift, that this duty talks about inequality of outcome, not just opportunity. So at the moment, it lies dormant in Westminster. The only thing standing between us and having this law active, it's already written, it's already on the statute books. It just needs someone to announce a start date. That's all it needs. And that's what this campaign is calling for. So although it remains dormant in Westminster, we want to wake it up through this Make Equality Real campaign that we're all part of. So the Equality Trust has been working on this duty for quite some time. We recognise the potential, and we're campaigning since 2017, in particular, working for national commencement. But it was clear that governments at that time, had no interest, announced that they wouldn't be commencing it. And so we pivoted to supporting and empowering campaigns by local grassroots communities across the country, and saw some success with some local authorities voluntarily adopting it as good practice. So if you haven't already checked with your local council, it might be interesting to ask or campaign for them to voluntarily adopt it as good practice while we're waiting for the formal commencement at the national level. It's important to note that the United Nations wrote a damning report, I don't know if anyone saw the Alston report, on poverty in the UK. In my lifetime, I've never seen a United Nations report so damning of the UK government. And it described austerity as politically driven, systemic immiseration of people living at the sharp end. And I thought that was a really accurate description of that, I think some of the things we've been talking about tonight. And they criticised specifically the government for the non-commencement of the socio-economic duty, as have many charities and social justice organisations too. So it was promising to see that Labour, in its manifesto, pledged to commence this duty in this Parliament, and work has already begun towards that. However, this campaign is about urging it to happen not only urgently because of a desperate need out there, but also in a meaningful way that makes sure that the voices of lived experience are around the table, and the voices of trade unions and our social justice movement to be part of that implementation plans to make sure it's rolled out, not as a token gesture, as we some see, but actually as a meaningful change-making tool. So I appreciate that many of us will be out there trying to engage people in these conversations and win support. And that's not easy in our current climate of hostility and divide and rule. But sometimes the media in particular tends to divide people about this socio-economic duty, and has sometimes misinformed people that it will somehow mean that middle class people will lose out. And that's something that the right-wing press did back in 2010 when this was first brought forward. I think it's quite helpful to myth bust there. The socio-economic duty protects anyone who has socio-economic disadvantage, which anyone who's not over rich is experiencing. So yes, obviously there's prioritising those who are facing the very worst of this struggle, but actually there's something that's quite unifying that we can mobilise our members around there, that actually this is about protecting everyone who isn't at the top. So some of the strengths of the duty that we can present to people to engage them in our campaign is that it was originally designed back in 2010, informed by expert reports, including the Equalities Review, the Marmot Review that made the link between health and wealth and different life expectancies for two babies born on the same day in the richest or poorest postcodes of the UK, and other reports and consultation, including with trade unions and charities. It's also, unlike most equality laws we have, it's proactive. It's saying before you even write your policy, you need to consider what your policy idea's impact would be on socioeconomic disadvantage. And in order to achieve that, the positive thing is this has got to spark people consulting those who live the issue. So listen to those who live it is always our mantra in social justice. So it's got to spark that, because without those voices, they won't have those answers, because they're not necessarily, the policy writers aren't always living the issues. So the fact that it's proactive and preventative is really positive. It's also, although it doesn't mention class in the 47 words of the duty, it's inevitably linked to class struggle, and it is the closest thing we've ever had to recognising that in the law in the UK. So that's pretty powerful. It will also help us to address structural systemic inequalities, because it's looking at policy making and institutional practices instead of the neoliberal narrative that we've had for over 14 years about, it's sort of framed as individual misfortune if you're affected by austerity and poverty, or that you failed to aspire and graft hard enough to compete for your social mobility, and those dehumanizing narratives of austerity. This duty counters that. It recognises it's a systemic collective issue. It was pretty groundbreaking at the time when it was designed in 2010, though it hasn't been commenced in Westminster. It was described by some as groundbreaking, and even by one excited cabinet minister at the time as socialism in one clause. So certainly there's some potential. It's also expansive in a way that helps our campaigns because it goes across all departments and policy areas and at national and local level. And that's useful because how many of us have heard of separate campaigns to tackle the following different angles of poverty: child poverty, food poverty, wage poverty, period poverty, hygiene poverty, fuel poverty, pensioner poverty, funeral poverty, to even bury our dead. And so this goes across all of that in a more proactive systemic approach. And I think that's really positive, rather than all these reactive campaigns that many of us are having to do in response to these various kinds of poverty crises. It also supports intersectional inequalities. As was mentioned earlier, poverty is not shared equally across the population, and multiple oppressions overlap. We know that austerity impacted disproportionately sharpest for women, for children, and for racialised and disabled people. And Baroness Doring Lawrence's review of the negative impact of COVID policies on racialised people also called for the urgent activation of this duty. And of course, many of you all remember Doring Lawrence's son, Stephen, who was taken from us, should have been celebrating his 50th birthday last month. And she continues to campaign for anti-racist policies in his memory and is making that link between socioeconomic struggle and racial discrimination. And another positive note is that any shortfalls, if government or local authorities fail to implement this, we can challenge for the Equality and Human Rights Commission. There's a watchdog that would monitor and have powers of enforcement, as well as we can challenge it through something called judicial review if any policies such as the two-child cap, for example, could be challengeable. Academics have argued that it could have challenged austerity policies had this law been commenced back in 2010, which of course is by no coincidence or mistake, as we all know. So in summarising, thinking about what the socioeconomic duty could have potentially challenged had it been here in 2010 and can still challenge as soon as we get it into commencement, everything from closure of Sure Start centres, which we know were working in closing the gap between the richest and poorest kids at the early years, to the cuts to public services spanning youth clubs to NHS, survivors turned away from oversubscribed and underfunded domestic abuse refuge accommodation, the harms of privatisation and the transfer of wealth from public assets to private ownership that we've seen, the cost of greed crisis plunging people into debt, low wages, the two-child cap, evictions, homelessness, turning to food banks, feeling humiliated, I think is one of the things we can't measure in statistics. The humiliation of people having to go to food banks or not being able to afford to put the right size shoes on our kids' feet is something that we are hearing time and time again, and I have personal experience of with my family too. These issues could have been challenged. The welfare cuts from PIP-related deaths of disabled people, DWP being noted in coroners' reports for cause of death due to government policy. COVID policies that worsened existing inequalities, as Zita mentioned earlier. Poorer health, including mental health, nutrition deficiencies that have stunted child growth. Kids of a generation are a few centimetres shorter than the previous generations because of nutritional deficiencies, because of poverty. Life expectancy is not only stagnant, but worsened for women in 10% poorest areas of the UK on our watch. Poverty is rising, nearly 4 million in our country in destitution. That includes 1 million children. Over 8,000 people died within 6 months of having their PIP claim rejected, even though 72% of those PIP claims are won upon appeal. So people have died whilst waiting for what they were already entitled to anyway. This, my friends, is an example of what we call necropolitics. And if a business had caused 335,000 people to be killed by their policies, we might be talking about a corporate manslaughter case. So in memory of the over 335,000 people killed by austerity, let's mobilise. Thank you.